Welcome to the Atheist Witch Podcast, a bi-weekly podcast for witches or any curious minds to learn more about a non-theistic approach to witchcraft. Hello and welcome back to the Atheist Witch Podcast. I'm your host, and today we are kicking off something brand new, the Pantheon series. Over the next couple of months, we're going to tour the world's great mythologies, but not as worshippers. We are going as psychologists, historians, and scientists. Today, we start close to my own heart and heritage, the Celtic Pantheon. Now, if you've been listening for a while, you know the drill. I don't believe there are literal beings named Lugh or the Morrigan hanging out in the ether waiting for us to call on them. But as an atheist witch, I do believe these figures are still incredibly potent tools. We are looking at these gods and goddesses as Jungian archetypes. These are universal patterns of behavior, personality traits, and human drives that have been anthropomorphized or turned into characters, so that we can understand them better. They are mirrors for our own subconscious. And when we talk about working with a deity in this series, we're talking about identifying a specific psychological trait within ourselves and using the symbol of the god or goddess to bring that trait to the forefront of our conscious mind. Before we dive into the figures themselves, let's take a look at the observable reality, the context of the people who created them. The Celtic Pantheon didn't spring up in a vacuum. It originated with the Iron Age peoples of Western Europe and the British Isles. These were tribal societies living in a rugged, often harsh environment. Their world was defined by the cycle of agriculture, the necessity of warfare for survival, and a deep animistic connection to the land. Unlike the highly structured hierarchy of the Roman or Greek gods, the Celtic gods, who are often referred to as the Tuatha De Danann, or the people of the goddess Danu, were more like a superpowered family or a tribe of ancestors. They lived in the Hollow Hills or the Sidhe, right alongside humanity. This proximity is important to this conversation. These were not distant sky gods. They were tied to specific rivers, mountains, and skills. For the atheist witch, these hollow hills represent the liminal space of the subconscious, that fertile hidden ground just beneath our waking awareness, where our intuition and implicit memory live. This reinforces our view that the veil isn't a supernatural barrier, but a psychological boundary between the conscious and the deep mind. It's also crucial to remember that our understanding of them is filtered. The ancient Celts relied on oral tradition. They didn't write down their myths. Most of what we know comes from Christian monks who transcribed these stories centuries later. So when we read these myths, we're reading a history that has already been edited and ephemerized, meaning the gods were rewritten as historical kings and queens to fit into the Christian worldview. For the atheist witch, this is actually a little bit freeing. It reminds us that these stories have always been fluid. They evolve to fit the needs of the culture who's telling them. We are just the next step in that evolution, adapting them for a secular psychological age. Now let's take a look at 4 key figures from the Celtic Pantheon. We're going to strip away the mysticism and look at the psychological framework or the pillars that these figures represent. First, we have the Dagda. In lore, the Dagda is the good god, not meaning morally good, but good at everything. He's a father figure, often depicted as a giant with a club that can kill or heal, and a cauldron that never runs empty. The Dagda represents the provider and the competent self. He is that part of your psyche that feels capable, resourceful, and abundant. He represents the internal security of knowing that you have enough skill, enough food, enough resilience. And in modern utility for the science-minded witch, you could invoke the Dagda when you are feeling scarcity anxiety. If you're worried about finances or feeling like an imposter at work, using the symbol of the Dagda acts as a cognitive anchor to remind you of your own competence. It shifts your brain from a state of panic to a state of resourcefulness. Next is the Morrigan. The Morrigan is the Phantom Queen, a shapeshifter associated with war, fate, and crows. She is often terrifying in the myths, appearing to wash the armor of those who are about to die. The Morrigan is the shadow self and the protector of boundaries. She represents the fierce, unpalatable truths that we often try to hide: our anger, our capacity for destruction, and our absolute need for autonomy and sovereignty. She is the part of you that says no and means it. You work with this archetype when you need to enforce a boundary or do deep shadow work. In my practice, shadow work is a form of self-directed therapy to rewire implicit memory. When you are people-pleasing or letting others walk all over you, visualize the Morrigan. Use this archetype as the prompt to open your shadow work journal, perhaps even switching to a specific pen reserved for hard truths, as we discussed in our journaling episode. Document those fierce feelings. She is the psychological steel in your spine that allows you to face those pages. Brigid is probably the most beloved of the Celtic pantheon. She is the goddess of the forge, the well, and the flame, representing smithcraft, healing, and poetry, respectively. Brigid is the internal alchemist and the creative drive. She represents the ability to forge structure out of chaos. She represents the transformative power of the human mind, taking raw material like iron, words, or herbs, and turning them into something functional and beautiful. She is the spark of neuroplasticity itself, the ability to forge new pathways in your own brain. Use the archetype of Brigid when you are suffering from burnout or writer's block. She represents the discipline required to create. In my own practice, I lean heavily on this archetype during Imbolc to set my annual pillars and write them down on a paper Brigid's cross. I'll use that specific time also to burn the previous year's cross and identify exactly what I want to build next. When you light a candle for Brigid, it isn't a prayer. It's a signal to your brain that it's time to move from abstract inspiration to concrete planning and enter a flow state. Finally, we have Lugh Lomthada, or Lugh of the Long Arm. He is the master of all arts. In the myths, he gains entry to the court of the gods by proving he can do every skill: carpentry, smithing, warfare, harp playing, sorcery, and he can do them better than anyone else. Lugh is the polymath and the focused will. He represents the human capacity for learning and excellence. He is the prefrontal cortex firing on all cylinders, organizing complex tasks and executing them with precision. Lugh is the perfect archetype for career advancement or for studying. I like to frame Lugh as the archetype of the competency audit. Lunasa is traditionally associated with skill and the harvest, so when you are overwhelmed by a complex project, channeling Lugh is essentially a method of auditing your skills, looking at what you've harvested in terms of ability and applying it. It ties back to the tenet of abundance, by seeing to the needs of the self through capability. So, why does this work? If they aren't real, why bother visualizing them? This brings us back to cognitive science. When we interact with these symbols, we are engaging in a form of priming. Your brain has a filter called the reticular activating system, or RAS. It decides what information gets through to your conscious awareness. If you tell your RAS that the Morrigan is important right now, your brain will start scanning your environment for opportunities to assert sovereignty and enforce boundaries. By ritualizing these archetypes, you are giving your brain a user manual for how you want to behave. You're saying, right now, we are being Lugh. Your brain retrieves the data file for competence, focus, and skill and brings it to the forefront. It's a little bit of a hack for your own personality. It's also related to the psychological concept of enclothed cognition, the idea that wearing a lab coat could make you more attentive. And by wearing the persona of a god or goddess, you can adopt the traits associated with them. Before we close out, I have a challenge for you over the next week. I want you to pick one of the 4 archetypes, the Dagda, Morrigan, Brigid, or Lugh, that possess a quality that you feel you're currently lacking. For 1 week, I want you to method act that deity. If you pick the Morrigan, wear black or red. When you make a decision, take a split second to ask, what would the Phantom Queen do? And then do the thing. If you pick Lugh, approach your daily chores with the mindset of a master craftsman. And because we are scientists of our own experience, I want you to record the data. Open your grimoire or daily log, rate your feelings of competence if using the Dagda, or your ability to hold boundaries if using the Morrigan. Rate on a scale of 1 to 10 before you start the week. Then rate it again after. We are looking for efficacy. Did pretending to be the archetype move the needle? Record the data. And to help you out with the challenge, here is a simple bridge the gap ritual to activate the archetype. First, select a physical token that represents the archetype you chose, like a coin for Dagda, a pen for Brigid, or perhaps a stone for the Morrigan. Hold it in your hand and close your eyes. State your intention clearly. I recognize the resilience within myself. I assign this object as the trigger for that behavior. Obviously, you can replace resilience with whatever quality you're aiming for. And carry the token with you. Every time you touch it in your pocket, use it as a tactile cue to switch into that psychological mode. That's all for this first installment of the Pantheon series. I hope it's given you a new practical way to look at these ancient figures, not as masters to be served, but as facets of your own incredible mind to be explored. As always, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep making your own magic. Thanks for listening.